Hello everyone. I know in the past I said I wouldn't be doing any more review videos for a while, but I really want to review this one because this game honestly is one of the best games I've played as of 2022. Like, it is, if it was my opinion, I would have given the game of the year to this game for year of 2022 because this game, funny enough, even though it's 28 years old, which I will get into, it still is super fresh. And the graphics and music in this game is so good that I haven't felt... It's been a minute since there's been a game that was made recently that has made me compelled to continue playing it. And this one game essentially took me away from a lot of games that I usually play, like Smash Bros. And Call of Duty and stuff like that, just to play this and finish it. And it's the only game that's really kind of done that for a good minute. So I kind of want to talk about this game because it is extraordinarily good. But anyways, this game is called Live A Live, and I'm trying not to spoil too much in the game, but the game is 28 years old technically, so I guess we're just going to go ahead and get into the brief history of this game first. So this game was made for the Super Famicom way back in 1994, and it was a Japan-only release. We never really saw it in America or in Europe. You could play a Fran translation, but this is a fully localized version for the Nintendo Switch, so anybody can play it. And the Switch one has a lot more quality of life improvements because the Super Famicom one didn't really have a whole lot of little hints. So in this game, there's like these little symbols, or like the enemies that you fight against, they'll have like little symbols and their resistances. It'll show, you know, what they're weak to and stuff like that. In the Super Famicom version, you didn't really have that. It was a little bit more vague. However, the cool thing about this is because since this is a remake of a Super Nintendo game, it still has a Super Nintendo feel. Like, it has like the feel of games from back in the old days where, like, if you knew a certain thing, you could like beat a boss or beat somebody really quickly. And it's because of that I actually enjoyed this game a lot, because it felt like a game from back then when like you had cheat codes, or whenever you would find like secret weapons in certain places. Aside from that, this game is really well paced, and honestly it's kind of funny because this game is an RPG, so to a lot of people that would turn them off because of the amount of grinding that you would think you'd need to do, where this game's not really like a normal RPG in a sense. It's a mixture between regular RPG with tactics RPG. Meaning, like, you have a grid layout, and, you know, you gotta move your characters on the grid, and the grid will show, like, where their attack range is, how much power it does, what attacks can, you know, hit where. And, like every standard RPG, it has the level up system. But the thing about this one, though, is there's a very odd structure, if that makes sense. There's a very odd structure to how all these stories entangle, because basically with this game is, and even back then whenever it was on the Super Famicom, there are 7 different chapters, and then there's also a hidden chapter, and then, you know, the final chapter, and the chapters all vary. Like, you have a Wild West chapter which involves a cowboy, and you have a prehistoric chapter. All of them are based on different timelines, too. They're all based on, like, either prehistoric, modern, future, you know, medieval. You have the Edo Japan era. You have the Imperial China era. There's a lot of different eras. And all these characters have chapters that are based around them, and they all kind of work differently. Like, in one chapter, you could be just playing the game, not trying to, you know, die, but you can't fight anything. But if I'm going to talk about it like this, I'd like to get into the chapters, so I'm going to go ahead and start with the first era, which is the prehistoric chapter. This chapter mainly revolves around Pogo the caveman and his gorilla buddy Gory, and essentially in this chapter you're just trying to help this one cave woman out from being sacrificed, and there's not really a whole lot to it. It's supposed to be kind of a simple story. It is the very minute RPG of all the chapters, because there's not really a whole lot of, you know, text and dialogue, and there's not really a whole lot of interactions. Like, you'll have a few encounters with like a mini boss here and there, but other than that, this chapter is like a very short RPG in a sense. It'll take you probably around 40 minutes to beat the whole thing if you don't try to grind, because like you don't even have to grind a whole lot to even beat the first chapter. And actually, I need to bring this up too. Not all these chapters are in order. You can play any of the chapters in any order you want, except for the medieval chapter and the final chapter after that. Those ones you have to unlock. But the first 7 characters you can play with, and you can have those characters, you know, in any order you want. But I did it. I try to do it in a time, you know, stamp. I try to go from the very early era into the most modern era. Except for Wild West. I saved Wild West for last because I liked Wild West. But back to the prehistoric era. So in the prehistoric chapter, it's more of a simple RPG. There's not really a whole lot to go into it. It's very simple. Pogo is actually a tank character among the group of characters you'll see later on. He handles a lot of hits and he does really big damage, but he has very low health. So that's why later on in the game, you know, it's kind of difficult if you didn't grind a little bit because you lose your medic for a little bit. But you have Gory, so I mean, you have 2 characters and you can use items. That's another thing about this game. It's very much kind of like a Final Fantasy Tactics game, or, you know, something of that nature, where if you have characters nearby, you can do like a group heal with items, because certain items will heal people around you, or they'll just heal yourself. And you also have items that you can use to throw at other people, like weapon items and stuff like that. And you can attach items and defense, like you can attach equipment and attach weapons to your character as well, and that makes your character stronger in terms of defense, health, or attack. For the prehistoric chapter, it is essentially a simple RPG, and that shouldn't turn a whole lot of people off. And I think if you start out with that one, you kind of get an understanding of how the game is going to work. It's pretty simple, so it's a pretty good chapter all around. The only thing I didn't like about this chapter was probably the going into battle thing. So, in Live Alive, the going into battle for some of these chapters, it mainly revolves around touching the enemy, and it's not like where in Final Fantasy or Dragon Quest or like certain RPG games where you wander around a map and then all of a sudden a random encounter. This game has a pseudo random encounter, I guess. Like in some chapters there are set characters that if you touch them they're gonna, you know, start a battle. But for this one had a really weird mechanic where you would use Y, and Y is like your action command essentially for all these chapters, and Y makes Pogo smell the air and he can see all the scent clouds around him. He'll follow this little cloud and it gets smaller and smaller and smaller, and then when you hit the, you know, very end of the cloud, that's where the enemy is. Well, essentially, if you don't do that, and you just were to wander around the place, you would actually get hit with a random encounter, it would seem like, but it's really not. It's just you didn't use the scent clouds, so you couldn't really tell where they are. But that's kind of the only thing I didn't like about this first chapter. The second chapter we'll go into is this Imperial China chapter. Imperial China is kind of the weird chapter I mentioned earlier with the mechanic where you just train. I don't want to spoil it too much, but essentially there's 3 characters that you're training. And you start out as this old man, the Shifu. He knows this really strong kung fu that he's trying to teach his disciples, or he's trying to find disciples to teach. And he finds 3 disciples throughout the main game. And whenever he finds them, he trains them. Well, this is the part that's weird. So if you train a certain character, that character is going to be the one you choose, or that you start out with. And if you were to even them up and train every one of them equally, the game will look at the strongest one, which there's a definite strongest one, or the one that has the most, you know, HP and offense and all that stuff, and that's the character you'll be stuck with. But every character kind of differently near the end of the game, because when you get to the final chapter, all the characters will be usable. That's, you know, you'll see in each one of these chapters. It's kind of different though, because you can only have like up to 4 players or up to 4 characters in your party at a time in the final chapter. But essentially what you do here in the training will decide on who you have later on in the final chapter. And there's 3 disciples. There's Hong, Yun, and Lei. And depending on which one you train the most, that's the one that you'll use for the final chapter. And this is a very simple chapter too. There's not really a whole lot of battles that go on in this chapter. Most of the battles will be mainly in the training sessions that you have with the students, and a few fights that you'll have to do to get these students to become your disciples. And then later on, you'll fight, a big old area of like enemies and stuff like that. But that's kind of more near the end of the chapter, and that's when it starts to get a little bit more action heavy. But it gets a lot tougher depending on who you have as well around that time. But you can definitely beat the game with, all three of the characters. It's just that there are specific weaknesses and resistances that some characters have that makes the game go on a little bit too much, I feel like, near the end of this chapter. But other than that, this chapter was really great. The music in this chapter and the aesthetic, along with the gameplay of the chapter, I felt was very fresh. It was different. And this is kind of one of the main reasons as to why Live A Live is so unique and why I liked it so much. It's because it's not about you just going around and fighting random encounters, becoming stronger, and then defeating the boss. Every single chapter is basically like its own game. There's a different set of rules for every chapter, and there's just a different way to play every chapter. However, the gameplay is the same for each chapter, where you have the grid layout and you have certain attacks that go in a certain direction and some attacks that, inflict certain statuses and whatnot. The next chapter is during the era of Edo, Japan, and this chapter focuses on a ninja named Orochimaru. And the general mission of this chapter is to essentially get to the top of the tower and defeat the big bad boss that's on top of the tower. But this is kind of one of the biggest chapters in the game, whereas you have two different roads you can take with it. Well, I guess three. You can either be a pacifist and not kill anybody. You could be genocide and kill every person on the map. Or you could do neutral, where you could just kill the guys only and leave the women alive. And if you do that, you actually do get rewards for, doing all three. Except the genocide reward is more if you find the secret. But with this chapter, it's kind of weird, because if you do the genocide route, the only really good weapon you could get is if you fight the spirit named Muramasa and take his sword. And it's supposed to be like the demon sword, which has the most power to it. But in order to do that, you have to do a lot of grinding to get powered up. And then you also got to go get other teammates, find other teammates, and try to make it to Muramasa's chamber without killing one of the teammates off due to like status effects or effects of the land. And where if you were to do the pacifist route, you would use the invisibility ability more often in that run, because you would want to run away from all the enemies. And because of that, this is kind of Metal Gear Solid-esque, where you have to run around essentially and avoiding people. But there is a lot of weird specific actions that happen in specific places, where like if you entered a certain building, you would be forced into a fight. You'd have to kill the enemies that's in that area, which would ruin your pacifist run, because at that point you just killed people. So now you have to boot up your past save file, hoping that you do have a past save file, so that way you could start over again from the checkpoint instead of having to play the whole chapter all over again. As far as all that goes, Orochimaru's chapter is pretty good. I like the music. I like the graphics in this chapter, because they made Orochimaru's ninja abilities very stylish. He has a lot of effects with his moves, like his fire looks kind of crisp and swirls around. His water looks very fluid, like it looks like it flows and all that stuff. There's really cool effects with his attacks in this game. I like Orochimaru's attacks, and he apparently has one of the highest special attack abilities in the game, aside from another character. But to do some of the things in this chapter is a very long one, because this is one of the biggest maps in the entire game. But to get leveled up, you'd need to grind ghosts. There's like one storage house where you would need to grind on like 4 ghosts until you could, face the final bosses of the game. And that takes a good minute to get all the way up to level 14 or whatever level you need to get certain attacks that will do more damage to enemies later on due to their weaknesses. And because of that, it can be a very long chapter, and that's the only downside to it, really. But other than that, the music's pretty good, the atmosphere's good. Even though it took me a little bit to get there, I would still go back and play this chapter just to see like if I could beat Muramasa, because I didn't do that. I did the pacifist run, and there's, you know, a little bit of replayability to this chapter. It's just this one's kind of long. It took me a few days to get done with the pacifist run, and I had to look up how to do the pacifist run to stay away from all the triggers that would go off if you went in a certain room, or like who not to get and when not to get stuff. But other than that, Orochimaru's chapter is pretty cool. The next chapter to go into is the Wild West. And the Wild West chapter essentially is kind of the most unique, like, in terms of, I guess, there is another chapter kind of like it, but this one is more unique in time managing. It's kind of like Pitman mixed with an RPG. So essentially the chapter starts out with the character Sundown, which is the cowboy you play as, and he's being trailed by a bounty hunter named Mad Dog. And now after dueling with Mad Dog, you go to the Crystal Saloon, and that's essentially where you start the game. Is this cowboy comes up and you do dialogue to, you know, piss him off, and then that's whenever you start fighting this cowboy. Well, he gets defeated, runs away, goes to his gang, and then he's gonna bring his gang over to the town and wipe out everybody in the town, essentially. And that's where this chapter reminds me of Magnificent Seven, except you don't have 7 people, you have just Sundown, and then later on Mad Dog comes back and he agrees to help the town out, so it's you and Mad Dog essentially versus this whole gang. But when you do find Mad Dog, the game sort of turns into like a time managing game at that point, because now you're going on a scavenger hunt trying to locate items all around town to use as traps against Odio's gang. Well, when you do that, you would collect all the items that you need to, and then you go back to the bar and tell everybody, okay, I collected the items, now let's go ahead and set traps. Now once you do that, I think you can't go and collect any more items. I never tried it. I did all the item collecting in one go, so that way I wouldn't waste too much time. But you need to make sure that you give the correct items to the correct people, because if you don't do that, then the game kind of will see that you didn't give it to the right person, and the trap will be ineffective. Now, if you do it correctly, you can actually wipe out the entire gang except for the final boss. Or you could choose to wipe out some of the gang, or you could choose to wipe out nobody. And if you do that, you could still beat the boss and the whole crew. It's just kind of a little bit more, you gotta be more strategic, and you gotta know what you're doing. But that's where the chapter really holds its uniqueness. And besides, that's one of the quickest chapters too in the game. You don't really have a whole lot of time to invest in the Wild West chapter. It's very fast paced. And the music's pretty good in that one too. The music's really good in this game all around. The person that did the music was Yoko Shimomura. And remember this for this next chapter, but she was actually on the team of Street Fighter 2, and she did the music for Street Fighter 2 as well as some other Capcom games and a few Nintendo games as well. But the next chapter is the present day, and you play as Masaru Takahara. In this chapter, it essentially plays like a Street Fighter game, kind of. Now, the gameplay is the same. It's all based around, you know, placements and grids and tiles and all that and whatnot. But with this one, what you're doing to improve your character and get stronger is you have to let your opponent essentially attack you with their special move, and then Masaru will learn that move, and then he can use that move later on as his own. And if you don't learn all the moves, you learn them in the final chapter. And that's another thing to mention, is that the final chapter will pretty much make every character learn all their techniques before the end of the game. There is one exception, but I will get to that. So basically, it's just a kind of gauntlet where you go against all the characters in that chapter, and then you have the one final boss after you defeat all the characters as Masaru. And it's a fairly short chapter, kind of like Wild West. If you do it correctly, it shouldn't take you too awfully long. So after you get done with the Edo Japan, basically you get 2 short chapters after that, and these 2 chapters don't really have but maybe 7, or Wild West has about 3 fights. The present day there's about 8, because 7 for the challengers and then the final boss. And I didn't really care too much for the present day chapter. It was alright. I like the music, and I think Masaru as a character is a really funny character. He's pretty cool. But the chapter is kind of forgettable for me, because I just think it's kind of weird. The layout and everything is unique. Like, I don't forget that. But the characters in it is kind of weird. The amount of time that you see like certain characters is just kind of too fast for what the game is as an RPG. You know, you're trying to build character, and for all these characters that you see for like a total of maybe a minute, it's just kind of hard to attach yourself to those characters, except for Masaru, because you actually use him. The next chapter after that would be the near future, and in the near future you play as a kid named Akira. And essentially, it's kind of based a little bit on that anime Akira, where this kid has psychic powers, but he uses it to fight evil, or he wants to be a good guy, you know, and fight the bad guys. I didn't have any qualms with it like other people do. The chapter is very hated by some because people don't like the character itself, and they don't like the pacing of the chapter. I actually didn't find a problem with it. I thought the chapter was alright, and I liked the characters that were in it, especially Matsu. I thought Matsu was dope. And it kind of gets weird, but the chapter itself is kind of weird because near the end you don't really use the abilities that you grind for. You basically just get inside of a mech and then you use the mech to fight the final boss, kind of. And that would be technically a spoiler, but I'm just saying that just to let people know, like, don't grind too much in that chapter, because there's not really a whole lot you would gain out of doing so. Now, I mean, you would probably want to, just that way you could have a good souped up Akira for the final chapter, but it's not like there's any necessity to grind. And there's a really weird thing about this chapter where it actually interacts with the character in the next chapter. You need to learn how to synthesize items and basically combine them to make better items, and you want to keep those items so that way you can use them for the character in the next chapter, which I will explain about later. But as far as that goes, the near future chapter wasn't too awfully bad. There were some qualms I had with the pacing, and when I played it for the first time, I didn't realize that the grinding wasn't necessary. There are some workarounds too, where you don't actually need to be super powerful to like beat everybody, because that chapter was very heavy on like party leaders or leader enemies. And essentially what a leader enemy is they have like a flag icon next to them, and if you take them out, then the entire board gets wiped out. All the enemies on the board go away and you defeat it. It gives you the experience for all the enemies as if you defeated them. Like, that's a pretty handy thing, and it's neat to see that, so that way you don't have to like work your way on beating up every single character. But I just feel like that was kind of a grind heavy chapter when it didn't really have to be, it turns out. And the music was alright, but I wasn't too... The chapter itself just didn't really speak to me. But I think that, you know, to some, that chapter will probably be their favorite, so I'm not going to badmouth it. It works for what it is. I'll leave it at that. The last chapter is the Distant Future. And the Distant Future is actually a very unique chapter where you really don't fight until the very end. And you take the role of a robot named Cube, even though he's round. And this essentially is more of like a survival horror kind of, psychological horror kind of, I don't know, it's much more like a adventure of all the other ones. You essentially just go from where you're told to go and go to the next spot or where everybody is, and it's just basically like a story. You're just watching the story play out. And the only real battles in this mode, or in this chapter, is whenever you do this little side game that you play as a video game character, but that doesn't really do anything. And it's just kind of a little side game to pass time. And then you also have the final boss fight. Well, the final boss fight is essentially, you know, you have everything you need already, because you didn't have to collect anything. So you're just using the items that you had on hand, or you're just using like your own abilities. It's very much just a story-driven chapter. There's not really a whole lot about the fighting, and there is a little bit of dialogue, but I thought it was alright, and the music is pretty good. It gets kind of tense. For the chapter that it's supposed to be, it works really well. I like the distant future one. It was pretty nice. Now, I said that the last chapter was the final chapter, and it is until you unlock these next ones. The next chapter is the medieval era, and you play as Orsted, and this is where the game essentially turns into Final Fantasy, and you go around these different areas to try to find this hero of the Archon, so that way you can go and beat the big bad of the world, because he just kidnapped the princess. Well, in this chapter, there are random encounters, and the random encounters are just as frustrating. You could walk 2 steps, and then boom, right there, encounter. Go fight them. This one isn't as heavy and grinding, I feel like, though, for oddly enough for what it is, because while, yes, you could grind, I think the amount of battles that you would get from getting to point A to point B would be enough to justify not having to grind, in my opinion, because there is a little bit of backtracking that also happens where you had to go back and forth from certain places, and I think you get powered up just enough because of that. And I actually did the orders wrong. I went out of order because there's a specific thing you have to do where when some certain story event triggers, you have to go out and then come back to a castle, and I didn't do that. I went all the way to the place where we fought a mini-boss, and then I went back, and then I went back to the mini-boss, so I basically went down the same trail like 3 times, and that essentially leveled me up to about where I needed to be. And that's pretty much all in that chapter. That chapter, though, had really good music, and I liked the HD 2D in that chapter because there was a lot of forest and like grasslands and caves and stuff. It really shined in that chapter because there was a lot of different set pieces. So it was a very visually stylish chapter, and it looks pretty good. And like I said, the music was really good too. When you beat this chapter, it kind of reveals the intricacies of the main villain throughout the entire game. And it'll blow your mind when you find out who the villain is, but I'm not going to spoil it too much, so I'll leave other people to figure that one out. Now, the final chapter is kind of a spoiler of its own, because you're going against a certain person that you encountered in previous chapters, but this chapter is what allows you to go and find other characters from the previous chapters as well, and you band together and group up. This chapter is really neat because it's essentially the same as the previous one, whereas it's like Final Fantasy encounter rate where you move anywhere and you'll go into a random battle and whatnot. But that means that you can now level up your characters, and the characters that you level up now will be able to learn their abilities that you didn't get to learn in the previous chapters. And this is where the weird item synthesis thing comes into play. For some reason, they wanted you to learn how to synthesize items in the near future chapters so the way it can help out Cube for the final chapter. Because Cube doesn't find any items in his own chapter, which doesn't make any sense to me. And it was in the past on the Super Famicom, but it's also on the Switch version. And I still think this is one of the dumbest decisions in the game, is that you have to do stuff in the near future chapter in order to power up Cube for the final chapter, which doesn't make any sense. And like once you find those items and synthesize them, then you can transfer them over to Cube and give them to Cube in an accessory slot or as a weapon. And now Cube can use that item as an attack, like the normal attack or technique that all these other characters have. It's very weird. It's a very odd system, but at the same time, I mean, if you knew what you needed to do and you went and found a guide, or if you looked up how to do it, it saved you some time, and it was pretty neat to watch. But at the same time, I just can't help but feel how convoluted that kind of was whenever you could have just found the items in Cube's chapter and not had to worry about synthesizing items in the near future. But as the final chapter goes, it was a pretty good chapter. It was kind of as big as the chapter 8, or as Orsted's chapter, but it was, I don't know, it depends on how you put your take on it, because there's different ways you could beat it, because that's essentially the end of the game. So there's different ways you could have gone about beating that chapter, and there was like multiple different endings as well. But it was a very hard chapter, to say the least. That's about where the game picks up its difficulty, because the game itself is relatively easy, but the difficulty curve came really at the end of the game, where you need to be on point with your, item management and finding all the characters. And that all depends, of course, on how you wanted to beat the game. You could beat the game easy at bare minimum level if you picked a certain character. But it's a very unique game. And that's a very unique ending. It changes depending on who you play as. And you get different dialogue, too. So it's a very replayable ending. Now, it's kind of long, so I don't see anybody that would want to play it 7 times, but it's a very unique chapter. Now, as far as the entire game as a whole, what do I think about it? Well, first of all, it is one of the most stylish and graphically impressive game on Switch, I would say, just to talk about like all the stuff that goes on in like battles and around the world that you're in and all the environments. Like, some of it's simple, the amount of like gradient light and the effects of attacks and just all the cool textures that happen, and it's a very stylish game. I would say this game would probably be, since of its artistic style, it will be still good to look at and play in the future from about 20 years from now. It's very different from its Super Famicom counterpart, where it's not rough around the edges and it just looks good. Now, sound-wise, music-wise, really good music. I think the music for Live Alive, the new music that's been rearranged and stuff like that, all of it sounds really good. There's been so many tracks that I've had stuck in my head from Live Alive. The battle themes themselves are really good. Some of the main encounter or like story themes are really good. The title theme in itself is a really good song. Just like, it's crazy. Like, every single song from this game is a banger to me. As far as gameplay, it's kind of an RPG, so I would say that to some it's gonna tire out some people. But like I said, of how unique certain chapters are and how not every chapter plays like an RPG, I think it would provide so many breaks and changes that it won't make somebody feel tired of the gameplay loop. And even if we take out all the chapters that are kind of unique to the side, you really have only about 4 chapters that really play like an RPG, kind of. And even then, like, some of them aren't that long either. So I would say that about a good portion of the game won't really make you tired out with the mechanics. Now, the game itself, I feel like there's a few things that the game could have done better. The quality of life improvements in this game, there were so many, and it helped this game out a lot, actually. But the whole item synthesis thing from the near future to affect the distant future, that's a very odd choice for me still. Like, I don't understand why they did that. I think the items should have just been able to be picked up in the distant future. My final score for the game, considering everything on this game, with how good it is and how much they put into it and all the stuff I enjoyed about this game, considering this is a $60 game as well, and it's a remake of a game from 1994, I would give this game a 9 out of 10. There is so much good about this game that the mild inconveniences I had with it does not matter, and I would replay this game once a year if I had the time for it. And I could, with certain chapters, just play a certain chapter in a certain time of the month and just keep playing it over and over again, and it wouldn't get old. I feel like the gameplay loop is just good enough to where you could keep playing the game without getting tired of it, and that's always a good thing. But with that being said, that's about the end of this review on Live Alive, and I'll see y'all later.